Every barrel of oil comes with a story behind it. Every tank of gas you put into your car, every gallon that moves across thousands of miles of pipeline before reaching an American refinery, begins with a story that starts far beyond the northern border. It is, in many ways, a Canadian story. For years, this was one of those quiet facts inside the energy world, something everyone knew but rarely said out loud, a background reality that helped keep the continental economy running smoothly. But now, that quiet reality has moved straight to the center of a high-stakes clash that has been building for months, and it has now reached a turning point that Washington and global energy markets can no longer afford to ignore. Canada is the most important foreign supplier of crude oil to the United States, and that position is not just about convenience. It is a structural pillar of the American energy system. Every day, more than 4 million barrels of Canadian crude move across the border, supplying the refineries that keep America's industrial engine running and its vehicles on the road. That flow is the most important energy partnership either country has with any other nation in the world. It is a relationship shaped by geography, infrastructure, and decades of closely connected development. Yet despite all of this, the Trump administration's public language has repeatedly dismissed Canada, often insisting that the United States does not truly need its northern neighbor's resources. But this morning, a formal demand sent to the Canadian government exposed the contradiction sitting underneath that public message. The administration claimed America does not need anything Canada has, while at the same time demanding locked-in, preferential access to that very resource on American terms. The demand was a blunt attempt to use the importance of this oil flow as leverage, turning a necessity into a tool for pressure. But the refusal that came next, delivered by Prime Minister Mark Carney, did not just land in Washington. It echoed across global energy circles, reaching energy ministries, pipeline operators, and commodity trading desks around the world. The message was unmistakable. The country supplying 4 million barrels a day was not going to be ordered around. This is not just another episode in a familiar political fight. This is the point where the trade war has reached the foundation of the cross-border relationship itself: oil. Unlike lumber, which can eventually come from domestic forests, or manufactured goods which can theoretically be brought back with enough subsidies, oil is the irreplaceable lifeblood of America's refining system. It is the resource that helps keep gas prices steady and supports the very trade deficit the Trump administration keeps attacking, often without admitting exactly where that deficit comes from. To understand what is happening now, one basic question has to be asked. How can a government publicly claim it needs nothing from Canada while demanding 10 years of guaranteed, discounted access to the exact resource it says it does not depend on? That is the central contradiction at the heart of this crisis, and it is now a question every American lawmaker and energy executive is being forced to face. Let's break down this explosive development and what it means for the future of North American energy. The demand that arrived in Ottawa this morning at 9:05 a.m. was not a casual request for talks. It was a formal, detailed legal document issued jointly by the United States Department of Energy and the Office of the United States Trade Representative. Addressed directly to the Canadian government, the document described what it called an urgent need for guaranteed, discounted, and prioritized American access to Canada's crude oil exports, pipeline capacity, and energy infrastructure. In other words, this was not simply about buying oil. It was an attempt to reshape the entire energy relationship in a way that permanently benefited the United States. This was not one negotiating point. It was a package built around 3 strict demands. The first demand was the boldest. It required Canada to lock in the current discounted price of its crude oil for at least 10 years. That condition was designed to take away Canada's ability to negotiate better terms as global oil prices shift, effectively forcing the country to keep selling its most valuable export below market value to one customer for the long term. No matter where global oil prices move in the future, Canada would still be expected to give the United States a permanent discount. The second demand was aimed at stopping Canada from expanding its customer base. It required Canada to guarantee pipeline capacity priority to American refiners, including on any future export infrastructure. That would have the effect of blocking Canadian efforts to build new pipelines or terminals that could send oil to Asia or Europe. It would trap Canada inside a single customer relationship and keep its energy future tied almost completely to the United States. The third demand went even further, moving beyond oil itself and into strategic assets. It called for American investment access to Canadian energy infrastructure, including pipelines, storage terminals, and processing facilities, through frameworks that had never been negotiated or agreed to. This was a direct attempt to gain influence over the physical systems that move Canadian oil, turning a sovereign resource network into a long-term American strategic asset. When these three demands are read together, the pattern becomes impossible to miss. It follows the same logic behind every other resource demand this administration has pushed before, whether it was uranium, potash, natural gas, or electricity. The formula never really changes. Lock in the price, control the customer relationship, then gain access to the infrastructure. It is a strategy designed to turn Canadian sovereignty into something Washington can use as an American asset. This morning, that same formula was applied to the most important resource of all, and it was sent directly to a prime minister who had already rejected every previous version of this pressure campaign with a firm and unmistakable no. But before looking at the details of Carney's refusal, it is important to understand why oil is different. Uranium is strategic, potash is vital for farming, and natural gas keeps millions of homes warm. All of these resources matter deeply. But oil sits in a category of its own. It is the resource the Trump administration has repeatedly claimed Canada does not matter for. Just this week, the president stood in front of cameras and said, "We don't need their energy. We don't need anything that they have." That was not a small comment. It was a public dismissal of the entire relationship. And yet, only days later, in the very same week, his own administration sent a formal demand asking Canada to guarantee, discount, and prioritize access to that exact energy. This is not a small inconsistency. This is a major bluff being exposed in real time by the administration's own paperwork. It shows the gap between the public story being sold to a domestic audience and the private reality of an energy sector that still depends heavily on Canadian resources. This is the point where 6 months of trade confrontation finally comes together. The main contradiction at the center of this entire fight is now out in the open. Does America need Canadian oil, or does it not? Canada has a clear answer to that question, and Prime Minister Mark Carney was ready to deliver it. In Ottawa, at 2:14 p.m. this afternoon, the Prime Minister stepped in front of reporters to give Canada's official response. Standing beside him were the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources and the head of the Canada Energy Regulator. The presence of Canada's top energy regulator was not accidental. It was a clear signal to every journalist, diplomat, and market observer watching that this was not going to be a political soundbite or an emotional response to an insult. Canada was about to make a structural, regulatory, and sovereign decision about how its energy infrastructure would operate going forward. This was a message rooted in national interest, not political drama. Carney began without any long opening or polite build-up. He said plainly that Canada had received and carefully reviewed the joint demand from the American Department of Energy and the U.S. Trade Representative. Then he gave the only answer Canada could give: no. But he did not leave it there. He explained the refusal with the kind of sharp, detailed precision that has defined his approach throughout this confrontation. One by one, he took apart each of the three American demands. On the first demand, the 10-year price discount, Carney made clear that accepting it would mean Canada permanently giving up its position in global energy markets. No sovereign country and no major energy-producing nation anywhere in the world would accept that kind of arrangement. He also pointed directly at the contradiction in Washington's position. The same administration making this demand had publicly said only days earlier that it did not need Canadian energy at all. As Carney put it, "You cannot stand in front of cameras and declare that you don't need something, and then send a legal document at dawn asking to lock that same thing in for 10 years. He stressed that Canadians see that contradiction clearly, and the rest of the world is seeing it too. Then he turned to the second demand, the one that would give American refiners priority over Canada's pipeline capacity. Carney explained that this would prevent Canada from building the export diversity it has been working toward for years. This is the same infrastructure that would allow Canadian oil to reach buyers in Asia and Europe, giving the country a way out of a one-customer dependency. Canada has spent a decade building this optionality, he said, and it will not trade that independence away just to lock in a discount that the buyer himself claims he doesn't need. The third demand, which focused on American investment access to Canadian pipelines and terminals, was dismissed as another version of the same infrastructure takeover language Washington had tried to push into other trade frameworks. Carney said Canada's answer was the same as it had been every time before. Canadian energy infrastructure is not for sale through trade pressure. It is a sovereign asset, and the decision is final. After delivering that refusal, Prime Minister Carney announced 3 immediate and concrete steps that showed this was not just a reaction, but a major shift in Canada's energy strategy. The first step was a formal instruction to the Canada Energy Regulator to begin a full review of expanded export licensing toward Asian and European markets. This was a direct official move to reduce Canada's dependence on one single customer, exactly the kind of relationship the American demand had tried to lock in permanently. The second step was Canada's announcement that it had advanced talks with 2 Asian refining consortiums on long-term crude supply agreements. Those discussions had been happening quietly for months, but they were now being accelerated because the American demand for a fixed discount had given Canada the political reason to move faster and make the process more public. The third step was the activation of Canada's energy sovereignty framework. Under this new direction, any future pipeline or terminal investment proposal involving foreign capital will now be judged first through one main test: Canadian energy security and diversification interests. It will no longer be measured mainly by the convenience of one trading partner. The framework made it clear that Canadian energy serves Canadian interests before anything else. The relationship with the United States still matters, but it is only one factor among many. It is not the deciding factor, and no demand from Washington is going to change that. Global energy markets reacted almost instantly to Carney's statement. Within minutes of the message reaching trading desks, crude benchmarks linked to Canadian heavy oil started moving upward. Traders were beginning to price in the real possibility that American refiners may not always receive the same flow of discounted Canadian oil in the future. Energy analysts quickly shifted their focus to refining margins in the American Midwest, the region most dependent on discounted Canadian crude. They began calculating what could happen to fuel prices at the pump if the trade relationship became tighter and the Canadian discount narrowed or disappeared completely. Inside the United States, the political response came quickly, and it split along the usual deeply divided lines. Senators from refinery-dependent states began receiving a new wave of worried calls from refinery operators. These executives, who had already spent months dealing with concerns over the wider trade war, suddenly found themselves repeating the same warning Carney had made in Ottawa. They were telling lawmakers that it was dangerous for Washington to publicly claim it does not need Canadian oil, while privately demanding 10 years of guaranteed discounted access to it. By the end of the day, the exact contradiction Carney had named in Ottawa had become the main concern inside private briefings with lawmakers in Washington. So, where does this leave the situation now? There are 3 clear paths that could unfold in the coming weeks and months. The first possibility is that the contradiction becomes so politically difficult to defend that the demand is quietly pulled back within 30 days. If that happens, Canada's regulatory review for expanded export licensing would still continue because the diversification work was already underway. The American demand simply gave Canada the public justification to move faster. The second possibility is a much more dangerous escalation. The administration could try to respond by placing targeted tariffs on Canadian energy imports. But that move would immediately raise fuel costs in the Midwestern refining states, forcing Republican senators from those states into a direct and painful conflict with the White House. Canada's response would be just as immediate. It would speed up talks with Asian buyers, finalize long-term supply agreements, and permanently shift part of its export volume away from the American market. That would prove in the clearest possible way that the discount Washington has relied on for decades was never guaranteed. The third and most lasting possibility is that this week becomes the true starting point of a long-term shift in Canada's energy export strategy. This is the outcome that now appears most likely. Canada is moving toward reducing its dependence on one customer, especially after that customer has shown twice in the same week that it is willing to dismiss the relationship in public while trying to use it for leverage in private. Canada is now positioned to come out of this confrontation with a wider group of buyers, more export options, and a regulatory framework that permanently places its own energy security ahead of the demands of any single trading partner. Every barrel of oil really does carry a story, and this morning the Trump administration tried to rewrite Canada's part of that story in two completely different ways within the same week. First, by publicly claiming that America does not need it, and then by privately demanding 10 years of guaranteed discounted access to it. Prime Minister Mark Carney refused to let either version stand. He did not answer with outrage or political theater. He delivered a precise, regulatory, and structurally grounded refusal that said the contradiction out loud. Canadian oil fuels American refineries, but Canada decides who receives it, at what price, and through which infrastructure. That is what sovereignty means. That is what Carney has been defending from the first day of this confrontation, across every resource, every payment system, and every legal filing this trade war has produced. Today, he defended it through the resource that built the entire cross-border relationship in the first place. The refusal he delivered will not only be studied in Washington, it will be read in every capital around the world that is watching to see what happens when a country refuses to let its most important export be treated as worthless and indispensable by the same government in the same week. Canada's interests, Canada's infrastructure, Canada's decision, always. We will keep following every development as this story continues. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to stay updated on these critical developments. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.